Hi, so on today's video I will be building us a new kitchen table as we've been now living in our house for a bit over a year and a half, and we've been living with this small wobbly table that we bought second hand quite cheap when we moved in. And yeah, now that I've built most of the furniture that we are or have been missing, I thought that it would be a nice time or a good time to replace the first piece of furniture that we had when we moved in. So yeah, I guess let's get on with it and let's see what kind of dining table we can make. So I will be building the table out of some 52mm or 2-inch Finnish birch. These boards were quite heavy as they were 4 meters long, which is about 13 feet, and around 30 centimeters, about a foot wide. So I got my wife helping me out to do the first cuts to get these to be a bit more manageable, which I did by cutting rough size pieces with my circular saw. I'm not quite sure why I'm specifying that it's my circular saw, as it is really unlikely to have someone else's circular saw in my shop. Then the next thing I needed to do was to cut one of the live edges off, as these boards were too wide for my jointer like this. And as I'm gluing these, I would have needed to cut one edge off before the table saw anyways. To get somewhat of a straight edge, I use the Craig AccuCut jig with circular saw, but as these boards are a bit too thick to cut with the jig on top of them, I had to make 2 cuts to get all the way through. After I had cut all the boards, it was time to start the first daunting task with this project, which was the milling. The shorter pieces were easy enough, but some of the pieces were almost 7 feet long, so milling those was quite the task. Eventually, all the pieces were milled and I could move on to the table saw and rip cut the tabletop pieces to size. Before gluing the top, I still went on and did the in and out on the edges to ensure that the edges match perfectly. I first tried to glue up all 4 boards together, but that didn't work out too well, and my wife asked that wouldn't it be easier to glue 2 boards first together and then those 2 pieces together, which I eventually did, and using some coils I tried to get the panel as flat as I could. Unfortunately, I didn't film any of that after the first attempt. But anyhow, after the glue up was done, I scraped off most of the glue and started the second daunting task of hand planing the top so it's flat. And let me tell you that it took a while. But after some hours and big pile of shavings, it was good enough. Then I could cut the top to length, which is 170 centimeters or a bit under 6 feet, to fit our kitchen nicely. I did this using again the Craig AccuCut jig and made sure with a square that the end was getting cut, well, square. After that, it was time to start working on the base. First, rip cutting all the pieces to 10 centimeters or 4 inches. and as some of these pieces were quite long, I cut them to length with the circular saw and a square. The shorter ones I was able to cut with the table saw, and to ensure all the pieces that needed to match, I used a stop block. I believe that this is a good time to remind you that if you are enjoying the video, please leave it a like and subscribe to see more videos like this. Visualize the base a bit, as my plans for the table were yet again just sketches on a notebook. I laid all the pieces on the tabletop. I also wanted to add some shape to the ends on some of the pieces on the base, so I got these chamfers with the table saw set to 45 degrees. And as I couldn't use the stop block with the longer pieces to ensure the same profile, I clamped a scrap piece on my fence, and that acted as a stop for the cut. And as these were quite long and difficult to hold on the sled, I had my wife out helping me again. Next, it was time to start prepping the joinery on the base, which will be a combination of half lap joints and some butt joints with dowels. To make sure that the joints were exactly on the same spot on each stretcher, I clamped them together when marking and cutting the joints, as it doesn't really matter if the joints are exactly a certain distance from the end, but it matters that they are exactly on the same spot on each piece. I got most of the material off with a router, doing multiple passes to not take too much material off, and after that cleaning the edges with a chisel, I had the first part of the joints done. Then again, to ensure the exact same spot for the joints on each of the three shorter stretchers, I clamped them together and marked the spot, and did the same router chisel combo work to finish off the joints. One of the long stretchers had this big knot on it, and even though it will be facing the tabletop and be hidden under there, I thought that it would be worth it to carve it out and patch it with another piece. So I got correctly sized piece, marked it down, then routed and chiseled the slot and glued up the small piece there. I will also be adding a stretcher to the lower part of the legs to connect the two sets of legs to prevent them from starting to split. So I needed to cut the half lap joints for those as well, and since the other piece was quite short, I realized that I could just do it on the table saw, as it is quicker and easier. After that, all the half lap joints were done, and I needed to make holes for few dowels. One set on the other end of the legs to connect them to the grid which is under the table, and one on the small piece that is between the legs on each end. I drilled the first holes using a doweling jig, then marked the corresponding hole locations with dowel pins and a scrap piece of wood as a guide to ensure the same spot on each leg, and then drilled those holes on the drill press. I think it might be worth giving some background on why I've been building us so much furniture over the last year and a half. We moved in this house in the March of 2023 after living in a camper van for a year. And when we moved into that, we sold our old apartment and all the furniture we had in it. When we bought the house, we only bought few new pieces of furniture and some used, like the dining table we have, with the idea of me building us the rest and replacing the old ones eventually. Building the pieces myself, we can have everything almost as we want and we don't have to compromise on the size or anything. And at least, hopefully, these pieces will outlast IKEA furniture, which would be the other common option. Now that I've built most of the missing ones, it was time to pick up on the table and replace that with something that would be bigger, sturdier, and built to last. Then, one last thing I needed to do with the base before I could glue it up was to drill the holes for attaching the base to the tabletop. I will be adding threaded inserts to the tabletop so it can be disassembled easily if we ever need to move it out of the house. So I drilled bigger holes with Forstner bit to countersink the washer and bolt head a bit, and then drilled another hole in the middle of that through the piece. The holes are still bigger than the bolts to allow for seasonal movement on the tabletop. Now that all the prep work on the base was done, it was time to start the assembly. First doing one last dry fit to see that everything fits together, and then starting the first sub-assemblies. While doing the dry assembly, I also realized a small mistake that I had made, as I should have cut the half flaps on the ends for the long pieces on the other sides, so that they would lay on top of the shorter pieces, so they would stay together with gravity as well, as they are not being held together only by glue. Gladly, there is quite big surface they are glued together by, so I don't think this will be an issue. First, I glued up the legs for both ends and glued up the grid as well. That's going to be on top of the legs. After those had dried, it was time to connect the pieces together and add the stretcher to the lower part of the legs as well. I also did all the sanding for the table base in between the sub-assemblies, as it was much easier to sand the base down before it was assembled. After the base assembly, there was one last daunting task left: sanding the tabletop. After the top was sanded and ready, we lifted the base on top of the tabletop with my wife, made sure that it's centered, and marked the hole locations for the threaded inserts with a drill bit. And while the base was on top of the table, I also heated up my Maker's Mark branding iron and added the mark on the bottom of the tabletop. Then I needed to drill the holes for the threaded inserts. After that, the only thing left was to add the finish on the table. For this project, I went again with Rubio Monocoat in the color of Mist 5%. I did try out few samples as we were in between couple of shades, but ended up on this. After the finish had few days to cure, I added the threaded inserts and we carried the base and the top inside the house for final assembly. After that, the project was done, and I can tell you that after a bit over a year and a half with the small table, this bigger, sturdier table feels really nice. We have so much more space on the table and it doesn't move around with the lightest of bumps to it. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching and I'll see you on the next one.